The snow fell steadily on Christmas Eve morning in Copper Falls, Minnesota, blanketing the small mining town in a pristine white that muffled the sounds of families preparing for the holiday. 8-year-old Danny Morrison pressed his face against the frosted window of his family's 2-story home on Elm Street, watching the flakes dance in the pale December light. His breath fogged the glass as he traced patterns with his finger, creating temporary artwork that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. "Danny, come help your mother with the cookies," called his father, Robert Morrison, from the kitchen. Robert worked at the Mesabi Iron Range, his hands permanently stained with the red dust of the mines. But today, those same hands were gentle as he helped his wife Margaret roll out sugar cookie dough on their worn wooden table. Margaret smiled at her youngest son as he bounded into the kitchen, his sandy hair still messy from sleep. At 8 years old, Danny was the kind of boy who found magic in ordinary moments, collecting bottle caps, building elaborate snow forts, and asking endless questions that both delighted and exhausted his parents. His older sister Sarah, 15, and perpetually annoyed by her little brother's enthusiasm, sat at the kitchen table, reading a worn copy of 17 magazine. Before we continue with Danny's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this mystery, and please let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Now back to that snowy Christmas Eve in Copper Falls. The Morrison family had lived in Copper Falls for 3 generations. Robert's grandfather had come to work the iron mines in the 1920s, and the family had never left this town of barely 3,000 souls. Everyone knew everyone, and secrets were as rare as warm days in January. The town nestled between rolling hills covered in dense pine forests, with Lake Vermilion stretching to the north like a frozen mirror under the winter sky. Danny spent that Christmas Eve helping his mother in ways that created more work than assistance, sneaking tastes of cookie dough and leaving flour handprints on every surface he touched. Margaret, a patient woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair she kept in a practical ponytail, simply laughed and cleaned up after him. She had learned long ago that childhood was fleeting, especially in a place like Copper Falls, where boys grew up too fast, destined for the mines or the military. As evening approached, the family settled into their holiday traditions. Robert read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" in his deep, gravelly voice, while Margaret knitted and Sarah pretended not to listen. Danny sat cross-legged on the braided rug his grandmother had made, his eyes wide with wonder, despite having heard the story dozens of times. Outside, the snow continued to fall, accumulating in deep drifts against the house and transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious and new. After dinner, Danny begged to go outside and play in the fresh snow. The temperature had risen slightly, making the snow perfect for packing, and Margaret bundled him into his red winter coat, wool mittens, and the hand-knitted scarf his aunt had sent from Duluth. Robert reminded him not to go past the old oak tree at the edge of their property, a boundary that had been established when Danny was 5 and had wandered too far into the woods behind their house. The boy spent an hour building a snowman in the front yard, his cheeks burning red from the cold, but his spirits high. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he rolled snowballs and arranged sticks for arms, occasionally calling out suggestions or praise. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting yellow pools of light across the snow-covered street, when Danny announced he was ready to come inside. But as Margaret turned to put the kettle on for hot chocolate, she heard the front door open and close again. When she looked back out the window, Danny was gone. Assuming he had come inside, she called his name, but received no response. Robert checked the living room, Sarah looked upstairs, and Margaret searched the basement, but Danny was nowhere to be found. It was Robert who noticed the footprints in the snow, a clear trail of small boot prints leading from their front steps across the yard and toward the tree line where the woods began. The prints were perfectly preserved in the fresh snow, each one distinct and unmistakably Danny's, marked by the unique tread pattern of the winter boots Margaret had bought him just 3 weeks earlier at Sears. The family followed the trail with flashlights, calling Danny's name into the dark forest. The footprints led them along a path Danny had walked countless times during summer adventures, deeper into the woods than he was supposed to go. But after about a quarter mile, the prints simply stopped, not gradually, not obscured by wind or fresh snow, but abruptly, as if Danny had simply vanished mid-step. Robert called the sheriff's department immediately, and within an hour, half the town had gathered to help search. Sheriff Tom Hendricks, a man who had known the Morrison family since Robert was Danny's age, organized search parties with military precision. Volunteers combed through the woods with flashlights and lanterns, their voices echoing through the trees as they called Danny's name. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and everyone knew that a small boy wouldn't survive long in the Minnesota wilderness without proper shelter. But the most puzzling aspect of Danny's disappearance wasn't just that no one could find him, it was those footprints. Over the next 3 days, a search party scoured every inch of the surrounding forest, and the Minnesota State Police brought in tracking dogs. Those prints remained perfectly preserved in the snow. Fresh snowfall covered other tracks, wind erased footprints made by searchers, and the natural cycle of freeze and thaw that typically altered snow formations continued around them. Yet Danny's prints remained as clear and sharp as the moment he had made them. Margaret couldn't sleep, spending her nights standing at the kitchen window, staring out at those inexplicable footprints. During the day, she found herself walking to the end of the trail over and over, studying the spot where they ended, as if she might discover some clue the dozens of law enforcement officers and volunteers had missed. The last print showed Danny's left foot, the impression so detailed she could see the individual treads of his boot sole. Sarah, typically self-absorbed in the way of teenagers, found herself genuinely worried about her little brother for the first time in years. She had always complained about Danny's constant questions and his habit of following her around, but now the house felt empty and too quiet, without his chatter. She joined the search parties despite her parents' protests, tramping through the snow in her inadequate fashion boots, calling his name until her voice was hoarse. The story spread beyond Copper Falls within days. Reporters from Duluth and Minneapolis arrived, drawn by the mysterious nature of Danny's disappearance and the inexplicable footprints that seemed to defy natural law. The local newspaper, the Copper Falls Gazette, ran daily updates, and soon the story was picked up by newspapers across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Television crews set up outside the Morrison home, their bright lights creating an artificial day in the winter darkness. Dr. Patricia Wells, a forensic specialist from the University of Minnesota, arrived on the 4th day to examine the footprints. She brought sophisticated equipment to measure temperature variations, analyze the snow composition, and document every detail of the mysterious trail. What she found defied her scientific understanding. The snow in Danny's footprints was different from the surrounding snow, denser and more crystalline, as if it had been frozen by some process she couldn't identify. Robert took leave from the mine and spent every waking hour searching, his methodical nature driving him to explore areas others had already covered multiple times. He mapped the forest systematically, marking each section as he searched it, refusing to accept that his son had simply vanished. Margaret oscillated between hope and despair, cooking constantly for the volunteers while secretly fearing she would never see Danny again. The community rallied around the Morrison family in ways that reminded everyone why small towns could be special. Neighbors brought casseroles and watched the house when the family was out searching. The local church organized prayer vigils, And even families who rarely attended services found themselves lighting candles and asking for Danny's safe return. The hardware store donated flashlights and batteries, while the diner stayed open late to feed search volunteers. As the first week passed without any sign of Danny, the official search began to wind down. The state police had expanded their investigation to include nearby counties, checking with hospitals and contacting law enforcement agencies across the region. They interviewed registered sex offenders, investigated reports of suspicious vehicles, and followed up on dozens of tips from people who thought they had seen a boy matching Danny's description. But every lead proved fruitless. The footprints, however, remained unchanged. Snow had fallen 3 more times, accumulating several inches around the mysterious trail, but Danny's prints remained visible, as if they existed in their own protected space. Local children began calling them the ghost prints, while adults whispered theories ranging from the scientific to the supernatural. Some suggested underground hot springs, others blamed electromagnetic anomalies, and a few quietly wondered if something beyond human understanding had taken Danny Morrison. Margaret began to notice other oddities she hadn't perceived in the initial chaos. Danny's bedroom remained exactly as he had left it that Christmas Eve, his pajamas on the floor, a half-completed jigsaw puzzle on his desk, his collection of baseball cards scattered across his dresser. But sometimes, when she was certain no one had been in the room, small things seemed different. A toy moved slightly, a book opened to a different page, his favorite stuffed bear positioned differently on the bed. Robert, a practical man who dealt in the concrete realities of iron ore and heavy machinery, struggled with the inexplicable aspects of his son's disappearance. He had always been able to fix problems through determination and hard work, but this situation defied every tool in his arsenal. He began reading about missing children cases, studying statistics and patterns, searching for some logical explanation that might lead him to Danny. The second week brought a brief moment of hope when a hunter reported seeing a small figure moving through the woods near Eagle Lake, about 5 miles east of where Danny's trail ended. Search parties immediately converged on the area, using helicopters and tracking dogs to comb through the dense forest. They found evidence that someone had been there, a small shelter built from pine branches, traces of a fire that had been carefully extinguished, and scraps of red fabric that might have come from a winter coat. But the excitement proved short-lived when the fabric was tested and found to be from a different manufacturer than Danny's coat. The shelter was too sophisticated for an 8-year-old to have constructed, and the fire showed evidence of skills Danny didn't possess. Whoever had camped there was likely an adult, possibly a homeless person or hunter seeking shelter from the brutal Minnesota winter. The psychological toll on the Morrison family deepened as the days stretched into weeks. Margaret lost weight and developed a persistent cough from spending hours outside in the cold, calling Danny's name and searching the same areas over and over. Sarah's grades began to suffer as she struggled to concentrate on schoolwork while her family fell apart around her. Robert threw himself into the search with an intensity that worried his friends and colleagues, working 18-hour days and sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to rest. Dr. Wells returned multiple times to study the footprints, bringing colleagues and sophisticated equipment to analyze what she was calling the most scientifically interesting aspect of this case. Her preliminary report noted several anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of snow formation and preservation. The snow in Danny's prints maintained a consistent temperature that was several degrees colder than the surrounding snow, despite being exposed to the same weather conditions. More puzzling was the discovery that the snow in the footprints contained unusual mineral traces that didn't match the local soil composition. Spectrographic analysis revealed elements typically associated with much deeper geological layers. as if the snow had somehow been influenced by materials from far beneath the surface. Dr. Wells hesitated to draw conclusions, but her data suggested that something highly unusual had occurred at the moment Danny disappeared. The FBI became involved during the third week, treating the case as a possible kidnapping despite the lack of evidence supporting that theory. Special Agent Linda Crawford arrived from Minneapolis with a team of specialists who approached the investigation with fresh perspective and federal resources. They conducted extensive interviews with everyone who had contact with Danny in the weeks before his disappearance, analyzed phone records, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Agent Crawford was particularly interested in the timing of Danny's disappearance. Christmas Eve was an unusual time for a child abduction, as most families would be together and strangers would be more noticeable in a small community. She also noted that Danny's trail ended in an area with no road access, making it unlikely that he had been taken by vehicle. The absence of struggle signs or additional footprints suggested that whatever happened to Danny occurred without resistance or conflict. The media attention brought both help and hindrance to the investigation. While the publicity generated hundreds of tips and offers of assistance, it also attracted conspiracy theorists, psychics, and others whose involvement complicated the search efforts. A group calling themselves paranormal investigators arrived from Chicago, claiming they could communicate with Danny's spirit and determine what had happened to him. Sheriff Hendricks politely but firmly asked them to leave. Margaret found herself the reluctant center of media attention, with reporters constantly seeking interviews and updates. She struggled with the decision of whether to maintain public awareness of Danny's case or retreat from the spotlight to protect her family's privacy. The presence of television cameras and newspaper photographers turned her personal tragedy into public entertainment, a reality that both disgusted and motivated her. Local businesses began displaying Danny's photograph and organizing fundraisers to support the continued search efforts. The Copper Falls Community Center became an unofficial headquarters where volunteers coordinated activities, and families of other missing children from around the region came to offer support and share their own heartbreaking stories. Margaret learned that Danny's disappearance was not unique, that dozens of children vanished each year under mysterious circumstances, leaving families trapped in an eternal limbo of hope and despair. As January progressed, and the initial intensive search efforts gave way to a more systematic but less urgent investigation, the Morrison family faced the reality that Danny might never come home. The footprints remained visible, now protected by a makeshift shelter that volunteers had constructed to preserve them from the elements. Scientists, investigators, and curious observers continued to visit the site, but no one could explain why those prints persisted, while everything else in the forest changed with the passing seasons. Robert began having conversations with other fathers who had lost children, men who understood the particular hell of not knowing what had happened to their sons or daughters. He learned about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and connected with families whose cases had gone unsolved for years or even decades. The statistics were sobering. Thousands of children disappeared annually, and many were never found. The investigation took an unexpected turn when maintenance workers at the nearby Mesabi Iron Range discovered something unusual in one of the abandoned mine shafts. Deep underground, in a section that had been sealed since the 1940s, they found evidence of recent human presence: food wrappers, a makeshift bed, and most significantly, a child's red mitten that matched the description of Danny's winter gear. The discovery prompted a massive underground search operation that required specialized equipment and expertise. Teams of mine rescue specialists descended into the labyrinthine network of tunnels that honeycombed the area beneath Copper Falls. following passages that had been carved decades earlier by miners seeking iron ore. The tunnels were dangerous, prone to collapse and filled with pockets of toxic gas, but the possibility that Danny might be alive somewhere in the underground maze drove the searchers forward. What they found in the depths changed everything they thought they knew about Danny Morrison's disappearance. In a natural cavern connected to the mine workings, searchers discovered an underground camp that had clearly been occupied for weeks. Supplies were carefully organized. A ventilation system had been ingeniously constructed, and most importantly, they found clear evidence that Danny had been there. His initials carved into the cave wall, pages from his school notebook, and his distinctive handwriting on makeshift maps of the tunnel system. But Danny was not there, and the evidence suggested he had left the underground refuge several days earlier. Following his trail deeper into the cave system, searchers made an even more remarkable discovery, a natural passage that led to a series of hot springs, their warm waters creating a microclimate that explained many of the mysteries surrounding his disappearance. The springs generated enough heat to affect surface snow patterns and could account for the preservation of his footprints through some complex thermodynamic process that scientists were still working to understand. Margaret felt a surge of hope for the first time since Christmas Eve. The evidence proved that Danny had survived his initial disappearance and had somehow found shelter in the underground passages. His resourcefulness amazed everyone. The 8-year-old had not only survived alone in the Minnesota winter, but had created a sustainable living situation in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. The search expanded to include every connected cave and tunnel in the region, with teams working around the clock to explore passages that extended for miles beneath the surface. Geologists mapped the underground network, discovering a complex system that connected several counties and included both natural formations and abandoned mining infrastructure. The realization that Danny could have traveled significant distances underground opened new possibilities for where he might have emerged. On February 14th, exactly 7 weeks after Danny's disappearance, a cross-country skier discovered fresh footprints in the snow near Ely, Minnesota, about 40 miles northeast of Copper Falls. The prints matched Danny's boot pattern perfectly, and they led to a small cabin owned by an elderly trapper named Eugene Halverson. Halverson, who lived alone and rarely interacted with others, initially denied seeing any children, but investigators noticed smoke from his chimney and evidence of recent cooking for more than one person. When Sheriff Hendricks and Agent Crawford arrived at Halverson's cabin with a search warrant, they found Danny Morrison sitting at a rough wooden table, drawing pictures with colored pencils the old man had given him. The boy was thinner than when he disappeared, but appeared healthy and unharmed. He looked up when the officers entered and simply said, "I want to go home now." The reunion between Danny and his family was both joyful and overwhelming. Margaret sobbed as she held her son, unable to believe he was real and safe. Robert, typically reserved with emotions, wept openly as he embraced the boy they had feared was lost forever. Sarah, trying to maintain her teenage composure, ended up crying just as hard as her parents while hugging her little brother and calling him an idiot for scaring them so badly. Danny's account of his disappearance revealed a story of survival and unexpected kindness that captured the imagination of everyone who heard it. On Christmas Eve, he had followed what he thought was a small animal deeper into the woods than he was supposed to go. When he realized he was lost, he had sought shelter in what appeared to be a small cave entrance, not knowing it connected to the extensive underground network beneath the region. Lost in the tunnels for days, Danny had survived by drinking water that dripped from cave walls and eating emergency rations he found in old mining equipment caches. His exploration of the underground passages had been methodical and careful, marking his route and always ensuring he could find his way back to sources of water and warmth. The hot springs had provided refuge during the coldest nights, and his discovery of the connection to the Halverson property had been purely accidental. Eugene Halverson, it turned out, was not the hermit people believed him to be. The 73-year-old former miner had been quietly helping lost hikers and hunters for years, using his knowledge of the local terrain to guide them to safety. When Danny emerged from a cave entrance near his property, weak and frightened, Halverson had taken him in and nursed him back to health. The old man had planned to contact authorities, but wanted to ensure Danny was strong enough for the reunion with his family. The explanation for the persistent footprints proved to be a combination of factors that Dr. Wells documented in her final report. The hot springs created updrafts that affected local weather patterns, creating microclimates that could preserve snow formations under specific conditions. Additionally, mineral deposits from the underground thermal activity had created a chemical reaction that crystallized the snow in Danny's prints, making them more resistant to normal melting processes. The Morrison family's ordeal became a case study in both missing children investigations and the unexpected ways communities respond to crisis. The extensive media coverage had helped maintain public awareness of Danny's disappearance, but it had also brought unwanted attention and complicated the family's healing process. Margaret and Robert found themselves advocates for other families of missing children, using their experience to help improve search procedures and support systems. Danny returned to school in March, where he became something of a celebrity among his classmates. His teachers noted that the experience had changed him in subtle but significant ways. He was more mature, more thoughtful about consequences, and showed an unusual interest in geology and cave exploration. His maps of the underground passages proved valuable to researchers studying the region's hydrology and geological structure. Sheriff Hendricks reviewed the case extensively, identifying lessons that could improve future missing person investigations. The discovery of the underground passage network led to new safety protocols for the region and better coordination between surface and underground search efforts. The case also highlighted the importance of local knowledge, as Eugene Halverson's familiarity with the terrain had been crucial to Danny's survival. The footprints that had mystified everyone finally disappeared during the spring thaw, melting away like normal snow as temperatures rose and the ground beneath them warmed. Dr. Wells published her findings in the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences, contributing to scientific understanding of how underground thermal activity could affect surface weather phenomena. Her work on the Morrison case led to consulting opportunities on other unexplained disappearances. Margaret kept a journal throughout the ordeal, documenting not only the search efforts, but also the emotional journey her family experienced. Her writing became the basis for a book about the experience, with proceeds supporting the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She spoke at conferences and support groups, helping other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of having a missing child. The Morrison family's story concluded not with easy answers or simple resolutions, but with the complex reality of healing and moving forward after trauma. Danny's disappearance had changed everyone involved. His family, the community of Copper Falls, and even the investigators who worked on the case. The experience had revealed both the fragility of normal life and the strength that people could find when facing the unthinkable. Years later, Danny Morrison would become a professional geologist, his childhood adventure inspiring a lifelong fascination with underground formations and cave systems. He often returned to Copper Falls to visit the site where his footprints had once defied explanation, now understanding the scientific principles behind the phenomenon that had mystified so many people. The cave entrance through which he had first disappeared became part of a nature preserve, with a small plaque commemorating the events of that winter. Eugene Halverson lived quietly for several more years, occasionally visited by the Morrison family, who considered him Danny's guardian angel. When he passed away in 1991, Danny served as a pallbearer at his funeral, honoring the man who had probably saved his life. The old trapper's cabin became a research station for scientists studying the region's unique geological features. The case files remained open in the sheriff's department, not because the mystery was unsolved, but because the unusual circumstances required detailed documentation for future reference. Other missing person cases would be investigated using lessons learned from Danny's disappearance, and the extensive underground network beneath northern Minnesota would be mapped and monitored as a potential factor in future searches. For Margaret and Robert Morrison, the 7 weeks of not knowing whether their son was alive or dead had been the longest period of their lives. The experience had taught them about the preciousness of ordinary moments and the importance of community support during crisis. They never again took for granted the simple pleasure of their family being together around the dinner table. Danny Morrison's story became part of Copper Falls folklore, told and retold, with slight variations, but always emphasizing the themes of survival, community cooperation, and the mysterious ways that science could explain seemingly impossible phenomena. The footprints that never melted had been real, but their persistence had natural causes that demonstrated how much remained unknown about the world beneath their feet. The winter of 1985 would be remembered in Copper Falls as the season when an entire community came together to search for one lost boy, discovering in the process both the limits of human understanding and the unlimited capacity for hope, determination, and mutual support in the face of the unexplained.